Come back, going to be quite a busy day as far as business is concerned here on ENCA. The Reserve Bank has raised interest rates 6 times, that's right, 6 times in the past year in response to economic pressures, both locally and globally. So is it now on top of inflation? Do we get a sense we're getting on top of it? Well, let's bring in an expert on this. Always good to have a visiting professor at Wits Business School, Prof. Jannie Rossouw, joining us this morning. Prof, always good to have you on ENCA. So let's answer that question first. Are we on top of inflation, or are we in for a big hiding somewhere down the road?
Good morning, Gareth, and good morning to your viewers. In short, Gareth, it's necessary to ascertain whether inflation expectations have been contained. In other words, the Reserve Bank does not only look at the current level of the rate of inflation, but also at inflation expectations, because people act in accordance with their expectations. So if expectations have been contained, there is less need for higher interest rates. But if inflation expectations are still quite high, we will see further interest rate increases.
I'm glad you mentioned the word expectations, because those who live outside, Professor, I'm sure you'll understand, like me, who live outside the world of business and the economy, don't always understand how important those expectations are on the reality of the numbers that we see. So in your opinion then, of what you just said, have the expectations been managed and handled?
In my view, expectations are still for higher inflation going forward. In other words, if I say higher, I mean outside the target range that the South African Reserve Bank targets, and therefore it will be necessary to have further rate increases. Now, when we have rate increases, of course, we focus on the position of people who borrow money and who have to repay more. But we also have to remember that when interest rates increase, that is an improvement for people who save, people who have money in the bank, people who try to live off their interest. So there are always two sides to this debate. Unfortunately, in South Africa, those who borrow money are well organized and very vocal, and those who save are not well organized, not very vocal, but they are, of course, the beneficiaries of higher interest rates.
And I'm sure you'll agree as well, Prof, that when we look at the South African economy, the majority of people are actually the borrowers. The minority are the few who are able to save as well. Prof, coming up after 7 o'clock this morning, we have the Reserve Bank Governor, Lesetja Kganyago, with us for most of the hour. If you were here having a chat to him, what would you be saying to him, or what would you be asking him? Because you spoke about SARB and you spoke about interest rates and inflation. What would you like to hear from the governor later this morning?
Well, I would like to hear from the governor that the Reserve Bank will continue with its commitment to get inflation under control, that the Reserve Bank will continue to keep inflation under control, and that the Reserve Bank will continue to operate independently and with full autonomy in taking decisions in the best interest of the South African economy. I would also like to hear his views on the fact that inflation rates in other developed economies like the USA and the UK, those rates are now higher than in South Africa. And I would like to hear from him where those countries made policy mistakes and how South Africa will avoid similar policy mistakes.
I'm glad you mentioned the overseas policies as well, particularly when it comes to the US, Prof. Give me your thoughts on how closely do we watch what happens over in the US? Obviously, we always have our indicators in the morning. We had them earlier. We're watching the US dollar and all of that. And we always hear that when there's a change at the Fed, it's going to have effects for us. But how real are those changes when something happens over in the US? How profoundly do we feel that here in South Africa?
Well, the whole world feels changes in the US because the US economy is so large. The US economy accounts for something like 20 to 25% of world GDP. And with an economy of that size, there will be knock-on effects through the rest of the world. So all countries in the world watch the US Fed, and all countries in the world take cognizance of what the US Fed is doing. So in the US, there's now a serious inflation problem developing. A year ago, the talk in the US was that this will be transitionary and out of the system. I said already a year back inflation is never transitionary because expectations can change so easily. So it will be watching the Fed, but also watching inflation expectations in the US going forward.
And very briefly as well, Prof, as I say goodbye to you as well, do you imagine then we're going to see more interest rate hikes come November, and I think it's February, March of next year? And if so, would you agree with that? Just a brief final answer if possible.
Yeah, you must remember that I'm an inflation hawk. I believe inflation should be zero, and therefore I see a need for higher interest rates to push inflation much lower in South Africa. We cannot afford inflation at this level where it is at the moment.
And I'm sure many people would agree with you, and I thank you for your time. As always, visiting Professor Jannie Rossouw from the Wits Business School, giving us his thoughts on what's happening with the economy and also throwing ahead to what he would like to hear in our interview after 7 o'clock this morning with the SARB Governor, Lesetjo Kganyago.